Okay. Am I working now? Okay. I can't tell up here. Maybe that's just because I have such a loud, soothing voice, but it just sounded like the mic was on, so I had no idea. I would have just kept talking. All right. 1 Kings chapter 19. It's good to see everybody out tonight. Before we get started, we can go ahead and have a word of prayer to center our minds. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for today. We thank you for this opportunity we have to gather together. We recognize the great joy that is found only in you, and we recognize that the more we peel back your word, the more we study you, the greater you become, the more awesome the demonstration of your love is shown in the history of the Israelites and in the history of all man. We pray, Father, that you be with us as a congregation this evening in all the classes. Help us grow. Help us continue to mold our minds better according to your word, that much good would come from that and that ultimately you are glorified. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we're picking up in 1 Kings chapter 19, right after the events of chapter 18. So just to get the ball rolling, let's go ahead and read the chapter. It's fairly short, but let's get started on this, and we'll kind of dive into talking about what's going on here in this chapter. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough now, O Lord, to take my life away, for I am no better than my fathers." And he lay down and slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." And he arose and ate, and the journey, And he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. There he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And behold, and he said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And the Lord said to him, "Go and return to your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah, you shall anoint him to be the prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." So he departed from there and found Elisha the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen in front of him, and he was with the 12th. Elijah passed by him and cast his cloak upon him. And he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, "Let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you." And he said to him, Go back again, for what have I done to you?" And he returned from following him and took the yoke of oxen and sacrificed them and boiled their flesh with the yokes of the oxen and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he arose and went to Elijah and assisted him. So as I mentioned, chapter 19 picks up right after chapter 18. Chapter 18, we have this pretty awesome scene at Mount Carmel, up in the northern part of the land, Samaria, where Ahab is reigning as king over Israel. And we see this great display by God to demonstrate to the people of, hey, you've been asking this question. You've been limping about two opinions of who is our God. Is it Baal? Is it Yahweh? Who's actually the Lord in Israel? And so, and something that Elijah repeats multiple times is like, hey, this is why I'm doing this. Okay, at the end of this, if Baal proves to be God, that's who we're going to worship. If Yahweh proves to be God, that's who we're going to worship. And obviously, the Lord stands out while Baal remains silent. And, the people fall on their face, and pronounce that, hey, the Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. Which, does anybody happen to remember what Elijah's name means? That's correct. The exact same thing. Okay, very good. All right. So, this grand moment, right? This grand demonstration by God, where all the people fall down and all bow and admit that God is the true God. And they slay the 450 prophets of Baal, and the drought that has been going on for the last 3 years is ended. Elijah sends his servant up to the top of Mount Carmel, and 7 times, and he sees this great rain cloud. And the rain is going to be so great, the end of the drought is going to be so significant that he tells Ahab, hey, you better go home now, because when the rain starts, you're not going to be able to make it in this weather, essentially. So the drought has ended. This grand demonstration, God has been revealed to be the true God. But Ahab goes back and returns to Jezebel. And that's where we pick up in chapter 19. And so when it says Ahab told Jezebel all Elijah had done, essentially he read to her chapter 18, right? Now, how does Jezebel respond to this? Hostile. Okay, we can go a lot of ways with that, though, Jess. So how would you say, how is she hostile in this situation?
Because of what that would be built prophets of Baal.
Okay, so she's upset by it, right? Because one of the things we talked about last week, or I guess this week, Sunday, was the fact that Jezebel has kind of been spearheading and pushing forward this Baal worship, right? She has an intimate relationship with these prophets of Baal. It says they reclined at the table with her, so she is not someone who is just kind of aloof and standing over to the side. She is very much kind of the spearhead of this tag team between the king and the queen. She's the one that's like, hey, we've really got to push this out there. And since Ahab has married her, things have gone downhill very quickly. Not to say Ahab was on the right path before then, but things got bad very fast. And so Jezebel clearly takes what happened on Mount Carmel very personally. Go ahead, Gordy.
She says, may God do to me and more if by the end of tomorrow you're not dead.
Okay, right. So you didn't hear Gordy. He mentioned the fact that she makes a vow and tells them to send this to Elijah, relay this to Elijah. Hey, tell him, hey, all this stuff that just happened, you just killed all my prophets. Well, may the gods do that and more to me if you're not dead in the next, 2 days, by tomorrow. And so she's pretty serious about this. Jess, you had a comment?
God and Baal, and Saul his own, didn't impress her.
No, clearly not. And she still uses the term, may the gods, a very polytheistic, idolatrous kind of way to say it, right? May the gods, there's only one God, so I don't know what multiple she needs to get this done or who she's swearing to, but she clearly hasn't been swayed, right? Now, I don't know if, I think based on everything we read about Jezebel, she's a very stubborn, set in her ways kind of person, but she probably, more than anybody, would have needed firsthand experience of that event to even have it move the needle for her at all. So the fact that she had to hear about it from Ahab was already probably a huge diminishing return in regards to that story, right? So everybody else has that response where they fall on their face. Like, everything Jezebel's displayed does not seem that she is one for reason and taking the evidence in and making sound judgments from that. That's just my opinion. Other people might have a more, positive outlook on Jezebel, but the fact that none of you named any of your children Jezebel tells me that I think I might be in the same boat with all of you. There's just a few names that we just don't carry over from the Bible very much, so that's just my thought on it. But, there's a lot of ways you can look at that, though. I don't think any of us have been given the same display as Mount Carmel like that, but I think all of us can relate to a moment where we ignore reason for own personal pride, personal gain. What we want something so bad, or we're so stubborn in our ways, or we don't want to lose an argument that the truth is hitting us right in the face, and it's just like, I don't care. Like, I'm going down with the ship. I love being the devil's advocate at the very least. Like, I'd rather that than us just, shake hands, be like, oh, glad we can agree on that. But she's not been swayed. She responds violently. She's got this mission now. And this is going to set in motion everything that's going to happen for the rest of this chapter, is her response. Sorry. Talking about Jezebel killing people, and then you see your nephew smiling up at you. It's like, oh, a little contrast of events going on over there. Didn't know he was such a big 1 Kings 19 fan there. But so it's kind of a fascinating story because Jezebel only has a small imprint here, but it really is lasting in terms of Elijah's feelings throughout this chapter. And Robert mentioned last class about the very human-like emotions that Obadiah displays, where he is a God-fearing man, but he also just has the natural fear of Ahab and dying and being put to death if he doesn't deliver Elijah. But we see kind of a similar reaction here with Elijah, who has just had this grand display, and now we're going to see very human-like emotions from him. And I mentioned on Sunday is the fact that these are not one-dimensional characters, right? These are people. Just like each of us have differing emotions, differing responses to a lot of different scenarios in our lives, Elijah's going to be the same way. And so I think that just makes the Word of God even more authentic. The fact that I can read these and be like, this seems like a real person to me. Elijah doesn't seem like a fake, made-up guy that they just were like, hey, this will fit the character of the story. Let's write this down. This seems like a real person to me. So Elijah hears the news. How does he respond? The messenger comes to meet him. How does Elijah respond?
He's fearful for his life. Takes off.
Okay, he's afraid for his life. Okay, which makes sense because he was just told, like, I'm going to kill you in 2 days, like, or may the gods kill me, essentially is the message he's getting. Where does he go from? He's up in Samaria. He's up by Mount Carmel. He's so afraid for his life. Where does he go? What does he do? What's his journey take him in this fleeing from Jezebel? Beersheba. Does anybody know where Beersheba is? Down in Judah. Okay. It's down in Judah. So there's kind of a common phrase, right, when talking about the land of Israel, right, the promised land, from Dan to Beersheba. So you got northern end where Dan is, and that's where Jeroboam set one of the temples up, and so the northern kingdom focused up around there, and then as you get to the southern end, Beersheba is near the south of the promised land, so near the southern border of the promised land. So he's gone the entire breadth of the United Kingdom, In terms of geography, he's gone straight from the north, like all the way to the south through the kingdom of Judah, and he's getting as far away as he can. Even drops off his servant along the way, drops him off in that kingdom of Judah as he's fleeing from Jezebel. And then somebody tell me what happens when he goes and sleeps under this broom tree, and he's resting, and he has this interaction with God. We hear Elijah's first real response to the situation. So we know he's afraid, we know he's running for his life, but then the word of the Lord comes to him, and how does he respond? Or I shouldn't say the word of the Lord comes to him, but he reaches out to the Lord. The angel of the Lord comes to him. How does he respond? What's his reasoning? Yeah, Heather. Good. I think you made a lot of good points in there. And if you couldn't hear it, Heather, she mentioned the fact of the gentleness in which God handles the situation here. This is not one of those God, standing down and berating Elijah or anything like that. The way he handles this situation with Elijah is very gently and very fitted to where Elijah is mentally right now, emotionally, based on everything we're going to see from him. And so, kind of keeping that in mind. It's not even just in this singular response, but throughout this whole chapter, how God deals with him, there is some significance to that. And we'll kind of touch on, kind of God's ways of dealing with Elijah throughout this chapter as we go along. But that's very important to see that God does not come out and just immediately crush Elijah here or anything like that, despite his very downtrodden feelings of where he's at right now in this very overwhelming feeling of loneliness and solitude, that he feels like he's been on this grand journey, using this phrase, I am no better than my fathers, kind of contrary to a lot of the things that he's saying later, where he's going to talk about, like, hey, I feel like I've been the only one. Here, this initial response kind of makes it seem like, hey, I'm no better. I'm not even one standing against many. I'm just kind of in with the rest of the lot. So this first response is also kind of interesting. Ryan, go ahead.
Fleeing Jezebel, which is part of it. But I think also the other piece too is he left to get away from the noise, to get into a place where he could hear God speak. Like, just as an example for us, like when stuff's crazy, when we are in that depressive state, when we're overwhelmed, removing ourselves to just take a chance to listen, to pray, to talk to God. I mean, Jesus did that exact same thing many times, where he would remove himself from the crowds, go focus on time with him and God, and he'd come back recharged and anew, and that's exactly what happens here.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a part of it. I do think Elijah's a little bit less going in with this feeling of optimism, like, hey, I'm going to go down here. And I don't feel like he shows that same, I wouldn't say he's in as confident a state as Jesus, which none of us are, but right, but I think you're right in that, like, there is a part of him that says, hey, It does say he's fleeing for his life, but I think you're right in that there is an element that knows, like, it's not just Jezebel, it's the whole state of the nation and the constant surrounding of me seeing what I have, like this grand, like I'm never escaped from my grand task of trying to turn the people back. And every way I turn, I'm looking at it, I'm constantly reminded of like this grand task that's before me. And here, getting away from it, getting to be able to listen to God, I think that is a good connection to make there as well. Jeremy, you had your hand up?
All my family has been killed and I'm no better off than they are. I just need to die as well. I'm not any better than they are and I deserve the same fate. And especially when he says in verse 10, basically the people have killed everyone that supports God.
Yeah.
I mean, his name means Yahweh is God. So his family was obviously a righteous group of people. It's not that much of a stretch to assume that they were all killed by Ahab and Jezebel. He's the only one left. So he's not coming from a place of like tremendous success. He's a surviving member of his family more than likely. And in his mind, he's the only champion left for God. Which I think contributes to his state of mind.
Yeah, and there's some ways in which, I don't think it's, it's easy for us to look at chapter 18 and be like, why do you keep saying you're the only one left? You just saw all those people bow down and pronounce God as Lord. But I think I don't think that's the first time he's said that, because I think he's truly been isolated on he's not had buddies other than his servant that's been going with him. But in terms of being a prophet, he's gone out on a lot of these solo missions for God. And so I do think he feels a sense of, I'm the last one. Everyone else was killed. Not only, blood family, but also all of my, fellow coworkers in the prophet business are wiped out, right? I think we've all been in situations, not this extreme, but just like the arrogance to stand up even when we know we're wrong and just say, I know my way's right, even when you've got the losing side. I think there's also those times when there's part of you that knows you're not truly alone, but in the situation you're in, you can't fathom anyone else feels like you feel right now, right? Like everybody's had that, especially for guilt or just, being wronged by someone. We've all had that moment where it's like, no one has ever been as wrongfully, done this lack of justice as I have. And you're probably talking about somebody cut you off on 465 or something like that, right? But sometimes, it's not a joke. Like, sometimes there are serious situations. And it's funny when I read stories like this as a kid, I just think, man, my life's pretty basic and simple. I've got everything really good, and I really do think I have a very extremely blessed life. But then as you get older, you start realizing it's like, man, there's a lot of stuff going on in a lot of things are happening. And then you really get what everybody was saying when you had those preachers coming up there and talking about how, hey, the church is a hospital and we got a lot of sick people in here. We got people that are struggling. But as a kid, you're like, you don't know. I see so-and-so every week and he kind of acts the same. Or this lady always has candy and that's what I know about her. But as you get older, you realize just like Elijah, like Obadiah, these aren't one-dimensional characters. The people we have in here are not one-dimensional characters, right? We might see one side of them, which is the dangers of sometimes the masks that we put on, but we aren't one-dimensional. Not everybody is, I think I'm confident in saying, not everybody's having the greatest day today that's sitting in this classroom, believe it or not. All right? Not everybody is having the best day. And I'm probably confident there's somebody in this building who's having a bad day. And they still answered, oh, how's your day going? Good, really well. Things are going well. But that's just how we are as people. And I think it's one of the great parts of this story with Elijah. And I don't want to spend too much time just talking about his emotions in here, because how God responds to his emotions is really the crux of the story. But it's just important to note that with how we deal with these emotions here, how these characters are very real, and we have similar situations to them. And while we're not necessarily one against the rest of the nation, we have times when we are feeling one against many. And it's a dangerous, thing that can cause us to do irrational, foolish things, and with a very limited look at what's ahead, and we do things that in the long run are just going to hurt us, or things that might hurt us very quickly. Go ahead, Heather.
Really magnifies the importance of story and how much telling our stories matters. Because I can pretty much guarantee whatever story you tell, there's going to be somebody else who understands. And so if there's anything, at least kind of positive, that the internet has taught me, is that you're never the only one to do anything, or feel anything, or have something happen to you. And it's extremely therapeutic to tell your story, and when someone else comes up to you and says, that happened to me too, I thought I was the only one, there's like this instant bond. And it's a really incredible big experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think one of the great things about us here, right, this community here, is like there are days like during the week you're like, I think I'm the only one. And then you walk in and you're like, oh, yeah, I forgot about Lester. But he's here, right? Like that's just the way it works. And that's the refreshment that we get coming back here and the encouragement we can take from that. So Elijah has this interaction. The angel of the Lord, kind of gives him with this food these 2 times and tells him, hey, you're not enough for the journey ahead. So he gives him enough food that's going to last him for 40 days and 40 nights as he journeys from Beersheba all the way down to the mountain of the Lord. All right. And so we have this grand journey where somewhere south of Israel, Sinai Peninsula, Mount Sinai, the site where God delivered the commandments to Moses, we have Elijah going and dwelling in a cave. And so we have some overlap there, which we're going to kind of touch on how there's some overlap here between Elijah and Moses, but I do think there is some significance to those 40 days, 40 nights traveling from Beersheba all the way down to Mount Horeb. And so, I think that's a little bit too much of a coincidence because partially I think people say, it probably wasn't necessarily a 40-day journey. So, why 40 days, 40 nights? So, just something, little tidbit there. But Elijah stays in this cave, and the Lord passes by Elijah. Once again, similar language, right, to Moses on the mountain and the Lord passing by when he's in the cleft of the rock. Elijah here in the cave, and the Lord passes by. But how does the Lord present himself? What happens here in this presentation to Elijah? What passes by him when he's in the cave? Strong wind. All right, I don't know if it was like tornado. I've never heard the term tornado or whatever, but strong wind is one thing. That's the first thing that passes by. What else happens? Oh, I should ask, Jess, was the Lord in the strong wind? He was not. Okay, what passes by next? Ooh, Gordy, I'm afraid not. One more try. Earthquake. Yes, Gordy said earthquake the first time. That's what I meant to say. All right. Earthquake. Gordy, was he in the earthquake? He was not. What passes by last? Fire. Was the Lord in the fire? No. Then what passes by? What does Elijah hear or witness? Soft voice, a whisper. And it doesn't explicitly say the Lord was in the whisper, right? But it also doesn't tell us he wasn't. And so everything points to, yes, the Lord was in the soft and gentle voice. And how does Elijah, what does it say he does after he hears that? What does he do? All right, he covers up his face. Why might you cover up your face there?
Actually see the Lord.
Yes, it's the presence of the Lord, right? And not necessarily the full glory revealed, right? Not necessarily that, but it's still presence of the Lord, and he's covering his face. Yes, ma'am.
This 3 different times in preparation for tonight. So I'm just going to ask this question because I can't figure it out. Because in verse 10, it talks about Elijah's telling him, you know, Ahab got his question. And then God evidently says to him, go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. But then later, he comes to him 3 different times, and then in the soft whisper, and then he comes out of the cave. Am I reading that wrong? Like, am I reading it wrong?
No, I don't necessarily think that means he. No, it does say in verse 10 or that hey, come out on the mount before the Lord, which I believe the cave was somewhere on the mountain. Like I believe that's what's happening here now. I don't know logistically how that worked. Yeah, that's how I just thought it was a breakup of, God saying this, and then it says, and he said, yeah. Yeah, I honestly, I jumped right over it. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer to you on that one. But we have these 3 interactions. We have the low whisper at the end, the 4th interaction. And all this is after Elijah said, when God asked him, why are you here? Why have you come here? He says, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. He's used this phrase before, the I, even I only, am left. He used that in chapter 18 as well, talking about this one man against the world kind of thing. And God kind of asking him, why are you here? What? And we see his motivation. He talks about not only the fact of the fearing for his life, but he also talks about the fact of just the utter loneliness and the feeling of, like, I've been on my own this whole time. And, for all the stuff we've been talking about, right, this guy just had the biggest victory of all victories just days ago when this is happening. Just days ago. I guess at this time it would have been over a month ago. But chapter 19 picks up right. Ahab's left the mountain, goes right to Jezebel. Says that. And then he gets word back. So we're talking 2 months have passed when he had, the biggest stamp it, put it in stone, lock down, prove it. This is God. Like the Lord, he is God. Like that just happened. And he's down to the very bottom. Right? He's gone from the peak to the valley in, the quickest split of all time. But God comes to him and displays these different natures. Now, what would you say if you saw the first 3 things? I've never witnessed a tornado up close. I remember at Purdue one time there was like a tornado nearby, and I remember sitting in the bathroom for a little bit, but but nothing really happened. Like, I don't remember where it hit or anything like that. It wasn't anything that crazy. So I've never witnessed that. Has anybody ever witnessed a tornado or a strong windstorm pretty close? How would you describe it? Can you give me? Yeah, go ahead.
Very humble.
Humbling?
Yeah, it was about 100 yards from our office when it hit a few years back at Beach Grove. And it was like it came down on one side of Emerson and our building was on the other side of it. Pretty much took out a whole swath of Beach Grove.
It's a pretty scary. It's a scary thing because you feel so small, right? You feel so incredibly small, and you're helpless against it. Really, it's just a matter of laying down somewhere and hoping, right? It's just lying in wait. I remember one time I was asleep whenever that earthquake happened several years ago. That I didn't even know it was an earthquake. I thought I was waking up from some weird dream or whatever, and the house was kind of shaking, but I didn't even know till the next morning it was like that actually really happened. But definitely a strange thing. I mean, we don't get a lot of earthquakes here, but I'm sure some of you have experienced an earthquake. I'm sure it's the same kind of thing. Very humbling, very terrifying kind of experience, especially. And then specifically with the fire, I remember driving to golf practice after school, and I saw the smoke from was it the Amazon or Walmart? Walmart, right? I'm sure somebody else saw that too, from miles away. You could see this giant cloud of smoke, all right? And you just that's just one building there. And I'm sure, whenever they show those scenes of, forest fires out west or things, those are terrifying things to imagine, right? But those also, in this story, show an incredible display of power, right? That's what all of them have. They have this incredible amount of power to destroy anything in their path, to absolutely decimate, eliminate, as if it was never there. And can we all agree that this is not about how, hey, God's not in those powerful things? If you thought that's what this chapter is about, it is not. God is all those things. God is in control of all those things. God is master of all things that are beyond our scale of comprehension. He does have that kind of power. Yes.
He shows power to people who underestimate his power. So I think of the Egyptians. Those were powerful acts and displays of power to get the point across. Or Elijah several months ago, that powerful display was God showing his power to them. But God displays his power to his people in soft voices, in cares and acts of affection, in re-encouraging statements, in one-on-one conversations. And so, to me, Elijah didn't need to see these things. He saw it months ago what the Lord could do. So, I think this was just a reminder to Elijah that even in times of stress or even in times of difficulty, we don't often need the miraculous to change. We need the little things. And that's what kind of put Elijah back on his feet. It was the food, it was the water, it was the sleep, it was the conversations with God, it was the one-on-one. And I think it just shows the personal care that God adds specifically to his people,
Yeah, I think you made a lot of great points there about God working in the small ways there with Elijah here, just like with the food he gave him, with the low whisper, things like that. And I think the important thing is, that ties in with us is the fact that people can look at a grand display and be like, that is an incredible display of power. And when I see it, wow, that's amazing. And Elijah could see when he was on Mount Carmel, and all the people could see, that is the display of God. God, the Lord, he is God. What God is trying to get Elijah to see is the fact that there are also things that God does that you do not see. There are the small things. God is not just in the Mount Carmel scene. He is also in the small interactions that he has with each of us, how he supports us, strengthens us in common daily things that get us through the day. It's not always got to be a grand display of the utmost power that anybody has ever seen. It doesn't always have to be necessarily in the most miraculous of events, but the importance is God showing Elijah is, hey, you think you're alone, but that's because from your vantage point, from your point of perception, you don't see the low whisper until I show it to you. And then the Lord is there, right? He couldn't understand all the things in which God was interacting, all the ways in which God was involved, because God is more than just the grand displays. He's also in the simple and the mundane and the common things that we easily can overlook. That's what it's easy for us to forget about, because we want the grand. We want the over-the-top. We want the great displays. It's funny, I thought it's a good tie-in with Jesus when he goes to the crippled man, right? And, he has those two. He has the simple statement of your sins are forgiven, and then he has this grand display, right? Get up and walk. And everybody thought the amazing was the getting up and walking, right? That's the great rush of wind. That's the earthquake. That's the great fire. But the most powerful thing Jesus did was forgive the man his sins, right? The most powerful thing Jesus does for us is he forgives us of our sins, that he redeems us. And based on the way I act sometimes, knowing that, the scriptures, knowing that I believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and, I believe that I have life in his name and all this stuff, the fact that I can go out and do some of the bad things that I do at times, right, usually tells me I don't think about how God's, worked for me. Man, if I forget those simple things that really have grand meaning to me. And so God's interaction here with Elijah is saying, hey, I'm in the fire, I'm in the earthquake, I'm in all of that as well. But you need to note that I'm also in the soft whisper. You also need to know you're not alone. And he kind of, the rest of this chapter, he kind of lets Elijah know, like, hey, your sight is very short-sighted, all right? You're not seeing the whole picture here. And, he says that in a way, and this kind of goes back to what Heather mentioned earlier, is the fact he doesn't beat him to the ground and make him feel like nothing. The same way, he doesn't have to beat us to the ground every time. The word can encourage us and lift us up and meet us where we are. But, at the same time, though, God's not just going to hide away the truth. He wasn't just going to say, hey, Elijah, just be sad forever. Don't, ignore the truth. Just think that you're alone. Okay, if you think you're alone, just be alone or anything like that. He wasn't going to let that happen, because ultimately Elijah needed to know, hey, you want to get out of this? Here's the truth of it. You want to get out of the sorrow? You want to get out of this depression of feeling like you're the only one? The truth is you're not. I'm here. And then he lets him know all the rest of the people. Gordy, you had a comment, and then Ryan, you can go.
It's interesting, the way he talks to Elijah here, because when he tells him about this, about all, you're not the only one who has the power or kiss. But he gets them in a way, he tells them that, okay, what you've asked me for, you're going to get. I need you to do this first. Because you see him, he sends them to anoint king, 2 kings, and to anoint his replacement. So he's basically telling them, okay, yeah, you're going to get what you want. But I need you to finish this stuff up first.
Yeah, he gives him a task to do, right? Like he sends him on a mission after this to go to work, right? That's part of it. Ryan.
The sound of a low whisper has a little one by it. So down at the bottom it says, or a sound in a thin silence. And so I just looked up what a thin silence meant, and it's a Jewish idiom. That essentially means like complete silence, or
Yeah, I read something about that too.
and the article that I was reading was really interesting because it made me think. Elijah goes and he says, look, I've been very jealous. He gives this whole spiel, and he says, I alone am left, I'm alone. Right? And God, even though it says God's not in it, obviously we know who did those things, God. And so I almost think that it's God being like, you want to be alone? Here's what it's like to be alone. And then that thin silence happens, complete silence, and he covers his face in shame, and just like, okay, this is what it's like to be without God. And then he asks him that question again. He still says the same thing, but I think his answer is a little bit different this time. And then God then tells him, like, no, you've actually got 7,000 people behind you and ready to fight you.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, when all these displays happen, you're like, okay, he got it now, like what we're talking. And then it's like God asks him again, now why are you here? And it's just like, oh, he said the exact same thing. And I've kind of grappled with that too. It's like, all right, how do I take that, like, in a different route that, like, okay, but he's getting it now. Like, I don't know. I honestly don't. Like, I think there is part of him that, this is just me personally, that he's getting it, but also, like, it's not all been quashed and just taken care of, because there's, his interaction with Elisha at the end of the chapter is also kind of interesting, where he just tosses his cloak at him and is just like, all right, you're essentially my servant now. There's not really an anointing process, but I don't know how you anoint prophets back then, but I don't want to get on a huge spiel of hypotheticals or anything like that, but it is just kind of a interesting thing. He responds the same way, but God now deals with him differently. And maybe that's the greatest telling of how he's not in the same place, because God initially gives the display, shows him the three grand examples, and then the soft whisper or the quick silence. And then when he asks him again and he says the same thing, but God responds differently. This time he says, okay, go and do this. Go anoint a new king for Syria, a new king for Israel, and find your replacement in Elisha. And so it is kind of an interesting story. And to be honest, like, I have questions about it still. Like, looking over it, and there were a lot of spots I was like, okay, what does somebody else say about that? What does somebody else say about that? And yeah, I don't know on a lot of this stuff. Like, but to be honest, I can relate to that of like, hey, you can be uplifted, but you can still have the questions, right? Once again, I think it ties back into the very human response of it's like, all right, I'm good now. Everything ended, and now I'm here, and we're all good. And I'm just like, I feel like everybody's with me. But at the same time, you know, God does kind of give him what he wants, though. He does tell him, hey, you're not alone. Not every person is against you. You know, I can only think of, like, so many of my stuff are just dumb sports analogies. But honestly, like, there's just been so many times where I'm just like, Purdue is just the most unlucky, helpless piece of trash I've ever laid eyes on. And I just, you know, I hate it. And, you know, last weekend we got beat by a 16 seed, and only 2 people has it happened to. But, like, literally, if you looked at the statistics, this is the worst that's ever happened. And you're just like, but then you miss all the other stuff that happened. A lot of good things did happen before you got to that point, but scrape it all away. We're the only ones. We're the most miserable lot that's ever been in existence. You know, just burn it to the ground. I can't even look at that school anymore, right? But that's how quickly we go from a Mount Carmel to where Elijah is. And ours is, I'm sorry, but I haven't gotten any death threats recently. And I have teenagers daily, okay? So I would have gotten at least one by now. So, like, it's easy to shift those emotions, but how God deals with him and displaying, and just like, hey, you don't see it all, man. You see the grandiose, you see the overpowering things. Even we as people, when we've read these stories, we remember the big and significant stuff, but do we remember the small and the simple? I best let Dad make his comment so he can wrap up class. Sorry. All right, so that missed it. Let's go ahead and keep going. Yeah.
Hid himself, if you will, from God the way Moses did.
Yeah.
He saw something. That's where the authority was. And God goes on to say, this is what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And so we, today, as bad as things can get sometimes in the trials of life that the devil gives us, need to know that God has our back. He's in control. And he is going to take us where we need to go.
Very good points. I just want to finish with one last thing with the Elisha bit, because it is at the, but we've had this whole questioning of the job that Elijah's on and just the feeling of, notice he goes to Elisha, he kind of has this anointing process, tosses the cloak at him. Elisha comes to him and is like, hey, let me say goodbye to my family. But the last thing he does is the oxen that he was working with, he kills them. You know why? Because he wasn't coming back. Because he found his new task, and just like us, he's given it all he's got. There's no looking back. And Jesus says the same thing, all right? Like, hey, when he calls people and they say, hey, I'm going to go back, he's like, hey, if you got to keep looking back, then, you know, with the oxen, like, hey, this ain't the right place. So same as us. Wipe off that old slate, and we're moving forward with God. And Dad made a good point. Like, he's taking us where we need to go. All right, guys, chapter 20, those questions are in the back. We'll pick up on Sunday. Thanks, everybody.